June 7, 1944. The morning after D-Day, the French countryside near Saint-Miraglais was cloaked in mist. German soldiers, still reeling from the thunderous Allied landings the day before, scanned the roads with weary eyes. Among them was Oberleutnant Klaus Müller of the 709th Infantry Division, who would later write that what he saw convinced him the war was already lost. It wasn't waves of infantry or roaring columns of tanks that unsettled him. It was the endless stream of small, unassuming vehicles, American jeeps. One after another, they rolled off the landing ships, each fresh from the factory floor, identical in design and ready for battle. Müller counted more than 100 in the span of 2 hours, and the sight gnawed at him. Here was a revelation more powerful than artillery. Germany was not fighting a traditional army. It was facing a nation that had transformed war into an industrial enterprise, a war machine capable of producing and shipping entire armies of machines. In the Wehrmacht, vehicles were rare, carefully maintained and guarded. Each truck or Kugelwagen was a prized asset, but the Americans treated jeeps like rifle cartridges, used, replaced, and never missed. To German officers steeped in a culture of scarcity, this abundance seemed surreal. The jeep was not simply a tool of war. It was a message, repeated by every convoy that poured inland. The United States had the capacity to outproduce, outmaneuver, and outlast anything Germany could muster. By the second day of the Normandy invasion, German commanders were already recording in their diaries the unsettling reality of American motorization. Feldwebel Vera Lindemann of the 919th Grenadier Regiment reported that jeeps appeared in quantities normally reserved for ammunition rounds. Destroy a dozen one day, and twice as many would appear the next. The implication was devastating. American losses could be replaced faster than Germany could inflict them. What unnerved the Germans most was not simply the numbers, but the speed at which these vehicles could be repaired or replaced. A jeep struck by shrapnel or crippled by engine failure was not sent back for weeks of maintenance. Its broken engine was unbolted and swapped with a new one in less than an hour, often under enemy fire. German mechanics, trained to preserve and refurbish every part, could scarcely believe their eyes. The Americans did not cherish their machines. They treated them as expendable assets in a system designed to keep the war machine moving forward without pause. Standardization was the secret weapon. Every Jeep, whether stamped at Ford's Michigan plant or Willys Overland's Ohio lines, was built with interchangeable parts. A wheel from one fit perfectly on another, transmissions and axles slotted into place without modification. To the Germans, whose own vehicles often required handcrafted adjustments, this efficiency was as alien as it was alarming. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the jeep became more than a means of transport. It was a symbol of industrial warfare, a rolling reminder that America's strength was measured not in individual battles, but in the factories across the Atlantic. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schröder of the 352nd Infantry Division captured the mood in a letter home. The Americans fight a rich man's war. They lose a vehicle, and another arrives within minutes. We lose one, and the entire company feels it. His words echoed a bitter truth. Germany had entered the war with a doctrine rooted in preservation and craftsmanship. The Wehrmacht prided itself on machines designed for durability, precision, and longevity. But in Normandy, such values were suddenly irrelevant. The Americans had calculated differently. They built for adequacy and scale, not perfection. A jeep's expected battlefield life was just 90 days. Beyond that, it was statistically assumed to be destroyed or rendered useless. Rather than planning elaborate maintenance chains, American logistics officers planned for replacement. A wreck was stripped of usable parts, pushed aside, and forgotten. The battlefield itself became a moving assembly line, with convoys bringing in fresh supplies and vehicles, as though Normandy were an extension of Detroit's factory floor. German soldiers watched with disbelief as jeeps moved across terrain that their own planners had deemed impassable. The Norman bocage, with its sunken roads and thick hedgerows, should have slowed motorized forces to a crawl. Yet the little 4x4s drove through fields, over embankments, even cutting paths around obstacles that stalled heavier machines. Every hedge that was meant to channel Americans into ambushes instead became irrelevant. The Germans discovered that they could not predict, let alone contain, an enemy whose vehicles created their own roads. By June 10th, the scale of American motorization could no longer be dismissed. Over 12,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy, and the Jeep was the single most common type. To German commanders trained to expect pauses between Allied offensives, this mobility was confounding. Instead of slowing down to consolidate, American reconnaissance patrols darted behind German lines, artillery observers shifted positions before counterfire could reach them, and supply units kept the front line fed with fuel, ammunition, and rations at a pace Germany could not match. Major Heinrich Zimmermann of the 12th SS Panzer Division noted bitterly, "The Americans have removed the friction from war." His words referenced the Prussian theorist Clausewitz, who had described war as a realm of uncertainty, delay, and chance. Yet to German eyes, the American supply chain seemed to erase those very obstacles. Convoys arrived daily, carrying not only food and fuel, but entire engines, transmissions, and crates of spare parts, all packaged and delivered with mathematical precision. German tactics, destroying bridges, mining roads, staging ambushes, produced only fleeting victories. A destroyed jeep was simply replaced. A broken bridge was bypassed by engineers carrying portable spans on the very same jeeps meant to be halted. Ambushes yielded only temporary gaps before new convoys appeared. Every tactical success evaporated against an opponent whose industrial depth seemed inexhaustible. The Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was the embodiment of American strategy, mobility, redundancy, and relentless pressure. To the German mind, this was not warfare in the traditional sense. It was industrial management unleashed on the battlefield. The psychological toll was immediate. German soldiers who had been told that Americans were soft and materialistic suddenly faced an opponent whose abundance defied imagination. Mechanics of the Panzer divisions examined captured jeeps and were astonished by their simplicity. Nothing was elegant, nothing was over-engineered, yet everything worked. Engines were sturdy, gearboxes robust, and the layout designed so that any soldier with basic training could perform repairs. To men raised in a system where vehicles were meticulously hand-built and maintained, this philosophy felt both crude and terrifying. Even more unsettling was the sight of African-American troops operating and maintaining these jeeps with the same competence as their white counterparts. Nazi ideology had long proclaimed racial hierarchy as a natural law, yet in Normandy, German soldiers witnessed an integrated motor pool functioning with flawless efficiency. For officers steeped in racial dogma, this was not only militarily disorienting, it was ideologically shattering. Meanwhile, American crews adapted jeeps with astonishing speed. Within days of the landings, field modifications transformed the vehicles into armored gun platforms, mobile radio stations, stretcher carriers, and mine detection rigs. German units, burdened by rigid doctrines and specialized equipment, could not match this improvisation. What appeared to them as makeshift was in fact a strength, flexibility born of confidence in a limitless supply chain. By mid-June, the Jeep was no longer simply transport. It was an instrument of innovation, its versatility magnifying the shock of American logistics. Each adaptation reinforced the impression that the United States was fighting a new kind of war, one Germany was unprepared to counter. By late July, as Operation Cobra prepared to break the German line, the sheer volume of American vehicles could no longer be rationalized away. Aerial reconnaissance estimated over 15,000 vehicles crowded into the Allied bridgehead, with jeeps making up the largest share. German intelligence officers calculated grimly. Even if the Americans lost half of them in combat, they would still outnumber the motor transport of any German division at full strength. The figures sounded like defeatist exaggerations in Berlin, yet for those on the ground, they were conservative truth. The Wehrmacht had entered Normandy with a doctrine rooted in the 19th century, horses pulling supply wagons, carefully rationed fuel, vehicles treated as precious assets. Against them stood an enemy that had industrialized every facet of war. When a road was mined, jeeps simply bypassed it across open fields. When bridges collapsed, portable spans rolled forward in convoys. Even attempts to choke fuel supplies failed, as gasoline flowed ashore in quantities Germany had not seen since the early campaigns of 1940. In the aftermath, many German officers would admit that the endless columns of jeeps were more demoralizing than the thunder of naval guns. Each vehicle was a messenger of inevitability. They carried not only soldiers and supplies, but a visible truth that America's factories were fighting this war as surely as its armies. As one officer later reflected, "We fought with courage, but they fought with industry." And in Normandy, we learned which of the two would decide the future of war.